Welcome to Atlas Live, Atlas Public Policy's live video podcast that brings together industry and policy leaders for lively discussions on the future of clean technology, transportation, the built environment, manufacturing, climate change, and more.
All right, welcome to Atlas Live. We are here in the second in our series on the race for the global clean energy supply chain. I'm really excited to be joined by Avery from SAFE and Kate Logan from Asia Society. We're going to dive into how China has gotten to this point and what it's going to take for the U.S. to compete, and how policymakers can balance deployment, affordability, and supply chain resilience as these technologies become central to the broader economic and geopolitical competition. So let's jump right in, guys. Thanks for being part of the show, and thanks for coming down to our office.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
It's great to be here.
All right. So clean energy is increasingly discussed along with semiconductors, AI, defense technologies, critical minerals. All those sorts of things are all being bundled into one. So from where you all sit, tell us a little bit about how we should understand this race for clean technology, and it's in particular how it relates to the broader geopolitical and technological competition that we face right now. Why don't we start with you, Avery?
Great. We really see this as a more holistic and macro challenge. I mean, certainly impacts clean energy, as kind of broadly defined. We really think about it more in the context of 21st century energy and technology. A lot of those supply chains run through China. And when we think about the competitiveness and the defensive readiness and the national security of the United States, addressing supply chain security is increasingly one of the challenges and attack vectors that we are concerned about in the context of global competition.
When you say attack vectors, do you mean like literal security threats, or you mean economic threats, or both?
Both,
Yeah.
And leveraging for geopolitical purposes as well. So, there are certainly direct national security risks, places where access to key critical systems could be compromised by a foreign adversary. And then there are also the trade and geopolitical leverage points that go along with the sort of disproportionate control that we see, in particular China, but other foreign adversaries having over the United States and our allies' ability to compete globally, to meet our energy needs, and to ensure that our national security is protected.
So before I bring you into this, Kate, I got one quick follow-up for you, Avery, on this point about the risk and the threat. Is this just fear tactics? We've in our country, we've often had a lot of challenges under the national security umbrella. We got to do this for national security. We got to do that for national security. Is this a fear tactic, or is it real? Like, are there examples that you can bring to the table that give people some context on why this is so important?
Yeah, and I think there's also some interesting global context, right? Looking at China has prohibitions around U.S. manufactured vehicles operating near Chinese military installations. There is a reason for those sorts of policies to be in place. We should be concerned about the reverse of those sorts of data collection, either at an individual or an aggregate level, taking place with devices that are operating on U.S. roadways, around critical infrastructure, military facilities, or other sensitive locations. I think it's really important to think about security broadly as a number of different buckets and categories, right? You have very direct national security risks where a foreign adversary could use access to critical infrastructure, to connected vehicles, other sorts of connected devices or items as a mechanism to attack the United States. You have economic security concerns, also very important, right? When we think about competitiveness of the United States and our allies, and the ability to for job creation, for economic might and development. You have geopolitical security. So that's something like allowing supply chains to be leveraged as part of trade negotiations or other geopolitical dialogues. We've seen plenty of those examples in recent years, with China in particular cutting off or limiting access to germanium, gallium, antimony, rare earths, et cetera, and watching the cascading effects from those sorts of supply chains vulnerabilities. Not a direct national security concern, but still a security concern. And then when we think about cyber and physical security as well, that can also fall into that national security bucket. of cybersecurity vulnerabilities that come from an increasingly connected world, and one where the supply chains are controlled by and delivered by a foreign adversary.
Wow. Well, before we go over to you, Kate, that was a really impressive use of the periodic table. Avery, nice job. Okay, over to you, Kate. Tell us how things look from where you sit.
So I appreciate you outlining a lot of the security challenges. And the first thing I'd say is in a geopolitically volatile world, it's really a question of how countries can safeguard the future of both their economies and their security.
Mhm.
So you did a great job of outlining what I see as also the two main security risks, which are on one hand cyber threats, and then the other hand these questions around economic coercion, especially as China is the dominant producer and control of a lot of the supply chains of critical material inputs as well as finished goods from a clean technology perspective. What I would argue or sort of push back is that there's also a series of trade-offs at hand for the broader future of the US economy that we need to consider in the broader picture. So questions around reindustrialization and job creation, especially in terms of the fact that manufacturing jobs have been declining in recent months. How do we secure the future of the US AI lead in terms of the energy that we need to meet for the rising demand growth? And we'll need a much more flexible power system. Right now in the US, we don't necessarily have the domestic supply chains to produce the battery technology that we'll need to be able to support that massive growth in the near term. And hopefully there are solutions for that in the midterm to the long term that we can talk more about.
Yeah.
What I'd argue for is a more holistic, sort of approach to the variety of trade-offs at hand. How do we meet labor interests in terms of workers' rights? How do we meet energy affordability concerns? And really the question is, how can we sort of catch up in a way that takes the whole picture into account? And the last thing I'd say, just from an energy perspective, is that obviously a lot of the critical inputs are needed for defense and other sectors, but really in terms of matching the supply side investments with demand,
Yep.
we'll need clean energy sectors to be able to do that because they're not commodities. They act very differently. So only small amounts of very specific minerals that Avery just mentioned are needed for certain defense inputs, whatnot. But to be able to create the demand growth needed to make those supply side investments viable, we'll need a much more massive deployment of clean energy and clean technologies.
Yeah.
And we've seen that played over the
Mhm.
past 100 years, right? Where the U.S. Our defensive readiness has been in large part tied to and supported by robust consumer supply chains, particularly the automotive sector.
Mhm.
And the ability to have large consumer demand ensures that there is access for defense purposes. I mean, to your point, Defense Department needs many of the critical minerals on the critical minerals list, but they need very small amounts as compared to consumer demand, which makes the sorts of just DoD or DW focused policies really at the mercy of consumer demand. So, to your point, when we think about that sort of demand creation, this is not just a challenge of how do you create supply and then hope that demand materializes. We really see this as the need for demand signals in order to generate the sort of production and supply chains that we are pushing for and calling attention to the limitations of right now.
So I see you guys having some synergy there on the need for policy in the demand side. But I want to ask go a little bit further into what Kate was bringing up, and China has an advantage right now. It seems in a number of these technology areas that we're playing catch up, right? And you mentioned the word reindustrialization, which is one of the most popular words right now in Washington, and it has been for some years. Because many people, whether both sides of the political spectrum, want us to make more things here. So when we look at this sector, what are the things that it's going to be hard for us to do, and hard for us to replicate when it comes to trying to catch up and perhaps surpass China? Why don't we start with you, Kate?
Sure. So I think, even though it seems like China got here overnight, that is by no means the case. And I'd point to four distinct factors that help China get to where it is today in terms of its clean technology dominance. The first is strong and sustained policy support, especially what I mentioned in terms of matching supply side investment focused policies, which includes subsidies, although I would push back on the argument that those are the main driver. They're certainly a huge part of the picture, but not the only or primary driver. As well as demand side policies like targets for electric vehicle deployment. So that's one piece that the US, for instance, had we continued with a lot of the elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, has the potential to do, but also challenges as well. I feel grateful that certain parts like the tax credits for batteries will continue out to 2034 because I think that's really important. The second factor is industrial scale up. And this is something that I think is much more difficult for the US to replicate, especially because China benefited from industrial clusters and vertical integration. When you have a lot of companies that are co-located in their manufacturing capacity, that creates these sort of organic synergies that's something that's extremely difficult to replicate unless you have that sort of environment in the first place. And again, in the US, there are attempts to try and figure out how to do this on a subnational level that are certainly worth investing in, but much, much more difficult to do at scale. The third is tech transfer and innovation.
I gotta go a little bit further on
Yeah.
that part. Like you're saying really difficult. Is that because we're just so far behind, or is it because, frankly, we just don't have the know-how in-house essentially to do it?
I mean, it's
Or
a little bit of
both.
both. These are relationships that started cropping up in the early 2000s on the China side, where you had initially Korean and Japanese battery companies that were producing in China. And then as Chinese electric vehicle companies came about, they started leveraging the technology from, some of their supply chains, and then eventually started doing that all in-house. And a lot of these companies are holistic in their nature. Like BYD is not just an electric vehicle company; it's a battery company, as well as many other things. And I have tech companies that are getting into the space. So, this idea that the US would be able to do that, over the next 5 years or on the time frame that we need to do that, especially without strong and sustained policy support, is a difficult notion to sort of entertain, even though we might be able to do it on a much smaller scale.
Okay.
Going back to the other two factors I wanted to bring up, tech transfer and innovation. US has been a leader in innovation on China's side. Of course, in the earlier days, some of the tech transfer was forced. More recently, China has become a leader in new patents and innovation. What I would argue the US needs to do now from our side is figure out how to reverse that and to gain from tech transfer from some of the leading Chinese companies toward the US, to think more about how to do that in a way that centers and advances US interests, especially in the battery sector. And then finally, human capital and entrepreneurship. And this is something that I think the US has, in some regards, a deep history in. I worry about the hollowing out of our science and technology education system, especially as you read statistics about all of the university programs that China has for things like mining and critical minerals processing. And the US has a very small capacity in that regard.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I'd outline the situation. And then the other reality I just end by saying is that, as the US or any other economy attempts to quote unquote catch up to China, China's going to be moving farther and farther ahead. So even though you have China's leadership, a lot of these companies are in this really ruthless competitive environment. They're losing revenues, but that's going to force consolidation. And that consolidation will actually, ironically, make these companies even stronger and drive more exports coming from China.
So Avery, can we do this? Are we gonna, it sounds pretty grim, right?
I mean, we absolutely can, right? And I think
Okay.
there's some good early steps being taken. I think, the challenge, as with innovation, is in sustaining the sorts of efforts that we've seen begin to gather momentum just in the last handful of years. I think there are the overarching challenge across each of the kind of pillars that you'd spelled out. I think maybe tech transfer is a really good place to look at it, where China had viewed tech transfer, particularly for state-owned or state-aligned companies, as strategic, right? That's they considered this in the context of national security for the last 20 years. The U.S. and our allies are sort of only just starting to realize the national security implications of critical technologies that the private sector can generate and needs to lead on. I think this is a theme that
almost sounds like you're saying we're kind of naive about what do you mean by that?
No, I mean, I think it's the limitations of, this goes to the vertical integration piece as well, right?
Yeah.
Where we have seen Western businesses increasingly disintegrate from along their supply chains. And
Yeah.
The reason for that is you look, the goal, right, is to operate as a more efficient company. So you get rid of the parts of your company that are less efficient, have lower margins. And I think the challenge when you're competing against state-owned entities is that they don't have the same sorts of priorities and limitations that Western businesses do.
Yeah.
So I think that's a part that we're still working to unpack.
Wow.
How do you maintain your principles as democratic values and free market ideals, and do so in a way that leverages those as a point of strength to compete on a playing field that it's not just not level; we're playing very different games, right, for different outcomes. And I think that's kind of one piece. And then the only other point I'll make here is, if you've being in Washington for the past 20 years, it feels like this is the same story we hear over and over, where just as something becomes really strategic for the Western world, we've realized that China has been investing in it for the past 5 years or 10 years and is either neck and neck in terms of technological innovation, and controls the supply chain. So we're seeing that right now on topics like physical AI around robotics. We're starting to see it on things like autonomous vehicles. We're certainly seeing it in the context of AI as well. And that's not an accident, right? That's 10 years. That's 20 years of 10-year plans designed to identify where the next strategic technologies or supply chains are going to be and invest in them. And that's not just the sort of direct investment that we would think about in a Western context. It's also setting policy behind it, supply side policy and demand side policy, and leveraging those for geopolitical goals.
Yeah.
And there's just one point I did want to come in on, which I think is important to recognize, which is that a lot of the Chinese companies that are clean tech leaders are actually private sector enterprises in the context of China. So, you have the situation where actually they act rather opportunistically in the context of global markets in terms of being motivated by business revenues. But they do have, sort of to abide by what Beijing's interests are. And I think a lot of these companies might be willing themselves to engage in technology transfer, but increasingly you see less willingness from Beijing to approve that, including a slew of recent policies that are basically putting additional controls in place because Beijing now sees these companies as so important to China's global leverage.
I see that's like a slightly different way of characterizing what he said around, maybe not state-owned companies, but more heavily influenced by the state companies who are effectively restricted from behaving in the way that their incentives would have naturally taken them. Is that what you're saying?
Right. And that's something that, it's evolving very quickly in real time, in the sense that, we look at things like the Meta Manus deal between Meta trying to purchase a company that was then basically rolled back by Beijing. And, maybe a couple of years ago, Beijing would have had a looser hand toward these companies, but now they see it as critical to sort of, in a geopolitically volatile world, being able to assert their interests.
I had to go one little bit further on this just because it came, we behave similarly. We had a whole thing with TikTok, right? Where we weren't going to allow, we needed that company to be not owned by the quote unquote Chinese government. So how is that different? How is it different here in that regard when it comes to the influence of the state on how companies operate? Because I think you gave a kind of an idealistic way of looking at how we're operating.
We're starting to see that becoming a real consideration, right? We're hearing about it in the context of Chinese automakers right now. We certainly heard about it in the context of TikTok. We heard about it in Huawei. There are instances where U.S. and frankly U.S. and its allies have been very attuned to the direct national security threats that a particular technology or sector might allow for. Critical minerals, I think, are much more of a macro challenge, but certainly rising onto that playing field as well. And in those instances, have taken direct action to prevent access to Western markets for Chinese technologies that would pose a national security risk. I think the only other piece to maybe flag around the kind of supply and demand concept is this idea of strategic oversupply, where your point on Chinese-based, particularly state-owned companies behaving what from a free market would view as very non-rationally, right? Producing when it didn't make fundamental sense.
Yeah.
There is the opportunity and the direction to do that when it serves a broader economic goal. And I think we see that in the critical minerals world pretty acutely, where the economics of producing some of the critical minerals that are on this list, the economics aren't there.
Yeah.
But they are essential for a supply chain that allows you to be vertically integrated and competitive. So there are some economics challenges on how we can actually deliver the capacity necessary if we believe that a supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And without the ability to address the full supply chain, we see that as being an existential risk. The second part of that, though, is this, along with this oversupply, is the ability to shift prices and to deploy that strategic oversupply at times when it can help to push out Western, more quarter-to-quarter profit-motivated companies from entering a new market. If the price of lithium plummets, if I'm investing in a lithium project, I'm going to look at the books and say, this doesn't make sense, right? I'm trying to deploy capital in a place where it's going to deliver return. And that's not the same sort of mindset that oftentimes happens when it's state-backed capital being deployed, which doesn't need to be as fundamentally tied to rate of return as it is to strategic outcomes.
So a couple of different times you all have mentioned innovation. And, one of the sort of adages in U.S. policy right now is like, oh, well, we made the batteries. We invented the batteries that China is now manufacturing at mass and eating our lunch on in terms of the global market. To what extent is that innovative strength that we have going to allow us to potentially leapfrog China from a technology standpoint? That's something that I think a lot of people talk about in developing countries, basically, where they skip technologies and jump ahead because they don't need the previous generations. We saw GM recently say they're not going to use an LFP battery. They're going to go to the technology that they developed. So that sounds positive. Like maybe the way that we'll sort of quote unquote win the race is by just getting ahead and skipping some of the technologies that are in place today. Can we do that? Do we have this industrial capacity to do that? And is there anything we can learn from China as we go about trying to do that?
So, yeah, I think the US is certainly still a leader in innovation, but we need a much more targeted approach. And we need to think of it on a sector by sector basis where the US has the ability to compete and also then to match that with a consistent policy support. So, as one example where I think we might be doing that well right now, I would point to advanced geothermal, which is sort of, all the rage in clean energy circles. And you see
Hot
a lot
rocks.
of consistent, policy support. And, this is also something that matches with a lot of other US interests in terms of having the technical capacity from fracking and other dirtier industries that can potentially be, revitalized through advanced geothermal. But I think there's also other areas where the US would benefit from thinking through how China fits into the picture. And I would argue in the absence of sustained policy support, especially on a subsidy or investment side, some of these Chinese companies are interested in investing in the US. So that's something that they're willing to put money toward it. Is there a way to do that basically allows the US to help scale up technologies that takes advantage of that potential investment that's not coming from things like the IRA at the current moment in time? So I think that's worth thinking about as well.
Okay. What do you think about that?
I mean, so you mentioned, like, do we have the industrial capacity to do it? And I think that's questions actually less about the industrial capacity than the innovative capacity. And we certainly have the innovative capacity, right? We've kind of proven this over and over again. The US has been very good at going from 0 to 1 and less good about going from 1 to X, so the scaling component. I think what I'm kind of concerned about is that that kind of narrative, while still pervasive, is kind of less and less true. Or the idea that the U.S. or Korea or Japan are the only ones who can do innovation.
Oh,
and
yeah.
China's not good at innovation. They're just
That's
good
the
at
part
building things and scaling. And I
Totally.
think that's completely shifting.
Yeah.
Where we are seeing, I mean, the idea of a leapfrog technology, like, that sounds great. But if we don't think that China is also investing in leapfrog technologies, right? Like the amount of capital being deployed, the lead that they have in some sectors, the supply chain control. I mean, they're in the catbird seat in a lot of these. So it's really going to require a holistic, systematic, and focused, policy set of policies sustained in order to address these challenges across any one sector. And then when you think about this as interconnected sectors, it becomes all the more challenging.
And you actually brought this up when you referenced GM investing in the partnership with Peak Energy and sodium-ion batteries. I would point to the fact that China's major battery companies, especially CATL and BYD, have already launched, very fruitful efforts on sodium-ion batteries. So I was at the Beijing Auto Show in April this year, and both of those companies had displays around, sort of like how their batteries perform in cold temperatures. So this idea that the U.S. will be able to, capitalize on a technology like that, again, going back to where China's innovating already ahead, and because the competition is so fierce, it'll be very difficult, I think, to do that at cost and scale without rethinking it. I think there are still areas where U.S. innovation could have a role. And again, what happens in solid state batteries is certainly something to pay attention to as well.
So you've mentioned this earlier, but China helped build their technological know-how through tech transfer and rules and regulations about doing business in China. Basically, you want access to the Chinese market, you gotta set up a joint venture, or you have to do other kinds of things to help empower our companies. They've obviously built that into large industries as a result. U.S. is doing things not exactly that in that exact same way, but we have our own methods, export controls, tariffs, domestic content rules, FIOC, all these different things set up to try to help influence where things come from and what gets done here. Which are these tools, and how are these tools working towards building resilience for us, reducing risk in the supply chain, or building some of that know-how that you said that we're lacking, versus actually just pushing us further behind while the rest of the world is moving ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the coordination and consistency of policy, frankly, federal, state, and local levels is necessary, and with our global allies is necessary, because the lead that China has is sizable. The control that they have over many points of the supply chain, particularly when we think about things like critical minerals, is not insurmountable, but it's tremendous, right? I mean, think about something like rare earths, where 90+% of processing capacity. We haven't talked about processing yet, but China also, surprise, surprise, is the leader in processing as well.
Right.
So, this is one of those challenges.
Do policymakers not know this? You think
they definitely know that now. We have spent a lot of time educating them.
I know you have, but do you think they know? Do you think they really know?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, on a bipartisan basis now, that we regularly get repeated back to us that it's actually about the midstream.
Midstream.
Yes, midstream choke points. We couldn't agree more, and we're very glad that message is taking root.
Okay.
Because I think what this is, again, is the challenge of trying to play catch up in this space of people hear critical mineral security. It's great. How do we think about the mining projects necessary to get these rocks out of the ground? Great. Now you've got the rocks. Well, you have to process them before you turn them into anything. Where are we going to process it? Oh, it's all in China. Okay, so now this is the supply chain control challenge of, if you actually have to have access to Chinese processing facilities in order to process your critical minerals, then you don't have security, right? And this is some of the challenge with things like stockpiling, of if it's not stockpiling plus processing capacity, and frankly, plus the next delivery points in that supply chain up through batteries, which, there's increasing, I think, recognition in Washington that batteries are a strategic asset. And without the ability for the U.S. to have the domestic or allied supply chains for batteries, it's huge vulnerability. We've seen a lot of this taking place in the drone space right now. So DoW investments into drone supply chains, particularly focused on battery technology, we believe that is appropriate. It is a much smaller market than the market for consumer vehicle batteries will be or would be. Grid storage as well. But I think that starts to get to this challenge of, it has to be a holistic approach, and that becomes very challenging to execute at a national or international level with the sort of effectiveness that is necessary to ensure that you're not solving one problem while creating a new one.
So we're almost out of time, so I'm going to combine then, what I was just asking about tariffs and domestic content rules and all that stuff with the idea that you sort of raised earlier around, allowing Chinese companies to invest here to help, fill in some of the gaps that that a loss in federal investments has created. What's your policy prescription look like?
Great question. I would say we refer to this broader question as the China question of whether you welcome, reject, or scrutinize Chinese inputs.
Mm,
And I would say, first of all, I very much agree with Avery in the sense that if you want to use protections, you need to match those with domestic policy support.
mm,
In terms of the China question more broadly, I think the US could actually learn from watching what other similar economies are doing. And I'd point to two varying approaches. One is the European Union, which basically, in the first place, allowed for Chinese investment to take place, but now is retroactively trying to figure out how to do that on terms that benefit the EU. So they're
yeah.
pursuing this policy called the Industrial Accelerator Act, which is basically trying to attach a bunch of strings like
Mhm.
percentages around joint ventures, job creation, et cetera.
Did they not know that this was going to happen? Like, how could they
I
have
mean, I
said,
think they were definitely caught blind to a certain extent.
really? Okay.
You talk to folks who were based at some of the German auto companies during the pandemic and
Yeah.
left China and then came back and were totally surprised at how overnight some electric vehicle companies had taken off,
Wow.
and sort
Okay.
of the reverse. So now you see Volkswagen, completing major layoffs. So they're in a really tough spot.
Hmm.
But I think the challenge of their approach is that like if you attach all these strings, can that actually work for companies that need policy certainty? And can they actually comply with it in a way that creates the reindustrialization that they want to see? On the other hand, I'd point to Canada as another example. And Canada very much in the first place followed the US approach by adopting tariffs on
Hmm.
Chinese electric vehicles. And now they've reversed that. They've adopted an import quota on a very small number of electric vehicles. But really, what they're trying to do is attract Chinese investment. But instead of adopting very hard and fast requirements, they basically put forward four major criteria that they want Chinese companies to meet, but giving them sort of like free rein and putting forward their like investment proposals and how they'll meet those requirements, which include things like labor standards, data security, sourcing from local suppliers, as well as JVs with majority ownership Canadian. So you see, for instance, the industry minister rejecting a proposal for cars in a kit from one company,
Hmm.
but still traveling to Shanghai recently and entertaining other proposals. I think there's a broader question, obviously, there in terms of whether Canada will be able to export those vehicles to the US market, whatnot. But I think this idea that maybe allowing for more innovation in a way that takes companies' business models and innovation into account is interesting. It's just we need to make sure that like the security hard lines are also taken into account. And I'm sure Avery has thoughts
Well,
on
yeah,
that. Yeah.
and that brings us back around to the distinction between economic security and national security, where like the Canadian pathway has taken some meaningful steps to address the economics, potentially address the economic security considerations. So requiring, some domestic purchasing for supply chains, thinking through some data control.
Yeah.
We would still have major concerns on the national security
Right.
considerations of having Chinese-owned operated vehicles operating on Canadian roads or U.S. roads, and the ability to collect data about either outside the vehicle or within the vehicle about,
Well,
at an aggregate level or an individual
well,
level.
we just dealt with that here with Polestar and Volvo. Can you explain what just happened then here? Because we've got those vehicles are Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. has a really important rule on the books out of the Department of Commerce,
Hmm.
which looks at so over the course of the past several years, put forth a very narrow rule focused purely on national security that would look at connected vehicles, so hardware and software, and autonomous vehicles, software only, and make some pretty high bar restrictions, although with a very narrow approach, so just limited to the infrastructure that allows for connection in and out of the vehicle, and put very strong foreign adversary protections in place. So effectively, Russia and China, although for purposes of this conversation, mainly China,
Hmm.
and that would phase in hardware for or software first, hardware second, and if you were a vehicle manufacturer who fell on the wrong side of some of these threshold things like ownership and control. Having a parent company who was owned by a company affiliated with the CCP, at particular ownership thresholds, then you'd have to go through a waiver process. That is requires submitting documentation, answering questions in the Department of Commerce, and then ultimately you receive a waiver to sell in the United States, or you don't. What we heard just recently is that Volvo was granted a waiver, so Volvo will be allowed to continue to sell vehicles in the United States. Polestar was not.
Yeah. Same parent company.
Same parent company. So Polestar will be
Fascinating.
has announced they're pulling out of the U.S. market.
Yeah.
We believe that this is the sort of rule that should be in place, that requires review, that has some real standards to it and actual teeth. I think there's a lot of interest. You mentioned the EU, who, when this commerce rule first came out, there was coordination, all right, a lot of information sharing from the U.S. to a broad group of Western allies on why are we doing this? Here's the research behind it. Here's the structure we're taking. And I think there was some original thought there might be some momentum for others joining this sort of effort. I think that momentum might be coming back now, although it may be a little bit too late. The horse might be out of the barn a little bit here. But I think the thesis is an interesting one, right? You start with a very narrow focus on national security before you start considering other things like geostrategic and economic security considerations. But what it means is you actually now have effectively a ban in place in the U.S. on Chinese vehicles being sold. We're now seeing how that plays out. And I think there's now a real question of
Unless it's Volvo, though.
So Volvo has gone through the approval process to receive their waiver.
Yeah.
They, as part of that, have, this is a closed door, right, conversation, but provided documentation that allowed the Department of Commerce to assess that on national security grounds, this is not a strategigic risk. A lot of that will be with data going on and off the vehicle, the ability to provide over-air updates, who's writing that software, who provides the hardware.
Just feels like that's the path. That's a path.
Are those decisions transparent in terms of, is there public information around how they were made, just out of curiosity?
I have not seen that. There was some direction as part of the final rule, if I'm recalling correctly, that would put some thematic boundaries around what these would actually, what we need to present and Commerce would consider. And it's something that we actually had advocated for was to not make it really prescriptive. We saw this with sourcing requirements as part of the 30E tax credit or 45X tax credits for electric vehicle sales, and then for battery manufacturing, where I think this goes back to the education for policymakers who now really understand the midstream, is understanding of what constitutes control. So it's not just about, does this company, the supplier, sit in China? It's not just, is it owned by, particularly in the critical minerals world, a lot of the extraction and mining facilities that are Chinese owned and operated aren't in China. They're certainly controlled by China. And then that gets down to some questions around ownership as well. And with ownership, I think there's the question is usually, well, how much ownership is too much ownership? And we really think that's the wrong way to ask the question, that you can have a very small ownership stake that comes with a lot of control, things like board seats or supplier relationships that can influence the ability for that company to either operate effectively, or can actually have access to the supply chain, right? So again, back to the national security considerations, and that I think is when we think about the evaluation of a national security risk, it really does need to be made on a case-by-case basis, where proof is provided that can show we have addressed any concerns that federal government might have. This is how we've addressed it, and this is why the structure we have in place would support our receiving a waiver to sell vehicles in the United States.
So last question to you, Kate, before we go. We're a little over time, but I just want to follow up, just close the loop on this thing. Is this the pathway to figuring out how to get, this balance between the US and China when it comes to investments and such? If you want to see Chinese investments here in the US, is it through commerce, or is there a law you think that Congress should be exploring to help, codify what the priorities are of the U.S. government? Because if it is just a rulemaking process, that can go from one administration to the next. And of course, there's already a lot of law in place, but I'm just want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I would argue that we actually have a lot of the policies in place to protect our interests through things like the connected vehicle rule and other factors. I think the question is how to provide enough policy certainty such that companies that want to invest don't fear future potential policies that might impact their business decisions that would actually not be in the U.S. interest, even if they're being pushed in a way that makes them seem framed as they're in the U.S. interest.
So you mentioned the commerce rule, does this need to be law? That is in the process right now for actually a slightly more aggressive, higher bar version by Senators Slotkin and Moreno introduced a bill to effectively codify this under national security grounds. And, again, bipartisan bill, bipartisan support. This is something that we are seeing, to your point on like providing that regulatory certainty, or that certainty for companies who are operating in the United States of, let's set the rules, let's set them in a way that drives toward the outcome that we believe is in the national interest, and then stick with our convictions and stick behind those for the sorts of, perhaps the pipe dream at this point for having laws in the books for 10 years that allow for sustained investment with an understanding that demand will be there when projects are built, and that, companies who make efforts to decouple or to address their own supply chain security are doing so knowing that the landscape that they're investing into is going to remain constant and sustained.
And that was the theme that we had in the last episode when we were talking with two companies about these issues. And so, we'll close it with that. Thanks, guys, a lot. This was a really fascinating conversation. But what's clear to me is that what's driving a lot of investment decisions right now is this risk and uncertainty. Laws provide some certainty. Rules and regulations can for a short period, but they are subject to the political winds, unfortunately, in this moment. And so it does come down to certainty, it seems. And it does seem like we've got a lot of work to do, that's for sure. So thanks again, Kate and Avery, for joining me on Atlas Live. And we'll be back again very soon.